It's a label his enemies have long attached to him. Now judges at the International Criminal Court in The Hague have issued a warrant for the arrest of Vladimir Putin, which accuses him of being a war criminal. In a statement, the ICC said President Putin and his Commissioner for Children's Rights are suspected of unlawfully deporting thousands of children from Ukraine to Russia during the ongoing war. Here's the president of the court, Petr Hovanský.
This is an important moment in the process of justice before the ICC. The judges have reviewed the information and evidence submitted by the prosecutor and determined that there are credible allegations against these persons for the alleged crimes.
So, how momentous is the move by the ICC? Anna Holligan is our correspondent in The Hague in the Netherlands, the home of the court.
I'm actually outside the ICC now. I have been speaking to the prosecutor, Karim Khan. This is a hugely symbolic move, but he says it goes much further than this. And when I asked him whether there was any realistic possibility of President Putin actually ending up on trial here in The Hague, he said, well, look at history. And he pointed to a number of other world leaders who have ended up actually behind bars. So he is optimistic this can happen. And it's actually really interesting that the court has chosen to focus on the deportation of children, because as we know, since the start of the Russian invasion, there have been allegations of many war crimes, crimes against humanity. And yet this one is very specific, focusing on Russia's alleged movement of children from Ukraine across the border into Russia. And Russia has, in the past, talked about this openly and said that it's being done for humanitarian reasons. Ukraine estimates around 16,000 Ukrainian children have been forcibly transferred into Russia. And under the Rome Statute, the document which underpins the ICC, constitutes a war crime, which is why Karim Khan, the prosecutor, has decided to issue these arrest warrants.
Will other arrest warrants follow, do you think, perhaps including crimes like the killing of civilians?
Karim Khan has visited Ukraine 4 times since the start of the invasion, and during his last visit he shared a photograph of him inside a children's home surrounded by empty cots. He told me today children can't be treated as the spoils of war. But he also talked about some of the other alleged atrocities which have been committed, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, for example, hospitals, power grids, water supplies. Anything that's not part of the military operation is unlawful. So it's quite probable, in fact, that more arrest warrants will be issued. But for now, they're focusing on this one. And the prosecutor says he is driven by the evidence. And that's what really matters here, because they're keen that this is not seen as some kind of symbolic or political move. It's based on the evidence they have managed to gather from Ukraine.
But what power does the ICC actually have? I mean, it can't arrest people, can it?
Very good question. Russia is not a member of the ICC, so the reason the ICC is able to investigate is because Ukraine gave the court temporary jurisdiction. Russia is unlikely to surrender any suspects to face trial, but what this will mean, the implications are, every member state is obliged to arrest any wanted suspects if they travel onto their territory. So all of the countries that are signed up to the ICC are now obliged to arrest President Putin if he travels there. So it will, in fact, turn him into something of an international pariah and make travel extremely difficult in the short term. Long term, there is a possibility, the prosecutor says, he will one day end up here in The Hague.
Anna Holligan. So, what reaction to the ICC arrest warrants has there been in Moscow? Olga Ivshina is from the BBC Russian service.
Oh, there was quite some reaction. It also depends which side you're talking about. So Russian officials have reacted promptly. The spokesperson for Russian Foreign Ministry said Russia is not a member of Rome Statute, which means it doesn't have to follow the decisions of ICC, and it doesn't mean anything for Russia. Former president of Russia and currently the head of the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, went even further and posted an emoji of toilet paper saying that you know what to do with this paper, referring to the decision of ICC. If we talk about the other side of the spectrum, about Russian opposition, they were quite cheerful and they reacted with posts like, wow, amazing, this should have been done quite a while ago. So they were quite supportive of the case.
But do you think, in a way, this might play into what President Putin is telling his people, that the West are against us and everybody is our enemy?
Yes, absolutely. They're going to use that line. We need to remember that from the very beginning of the invasion, this idea that Russia is saving children of Donbass was the main propaganda slogan.
Olga Ivshina from the BBC Russian service. Our security correspondent Frank Gardner examines the wider implications of Friday's development.
No amount of angry dismissal by Russia's leaders can change the fact that these arrest warrants are acutely embarrassing for the Kremlin and for President Putin in particular. Are we about to see the former KGB man standing in the dock in The Hague? No, not a chance. Russia doesn't recognise the ICC and it's hardly about to hand over its all-powerful leader. But the branding of President Putin as a suspected war criminal by a neutral pan-national body like the ICC, which has prosecuted plenty of hideous atrocities in the past, shows it does not accept Moscow's repeated denials. This is important when it comes to the information war, as Russia strives to convince much of the world that it's waging a noble war of self-defense. Having a president who's now a wanted war crime suspect, accused of overseeing the forced abduction of thousands of Ukrainian children, makes that narrative a lot harder to believe.
Frank Gardner. There were renewed concerns about the health of parts of the banking sector on Friday, despite recent multi-billion-dollar bailouts of two troubled institutions, the American bank First Republic and the European lender Credit Suisse. Shares in both banks fell and stock markets in the US, UK, France and Germany have edged lower. Our North America business correspondent Samira Hussain is in New York. I asked her about concerns that the banks haven't recovered despite big injections of cash.
In the United States, we saw something pretty extraordinary. We saw that 11 different banks have all pooled a sum of money and have lent it to another bank, First Republic. And this was really done to shore up the bank, but also to shore up confidence in the wider banking system. That doesn't seem to have convinced people on Wall Street. If you look at the way that markets have been trading, there's still a real sense of nervousness.
Is there concern about the health of the entire banking system?
Absolutely. And all of it is really just about this idea of contagion. Part of the reason why you're seeing all of this trouble with First Republic, it all started with the banking crisis that began last week when you saw that U.S. regulators took control over two U.S. banks. That spooked everyone, and investors were thinking, okay, well, now which bank is going to be next? As a result, you're seeing so much pressure on these smaller regional banks like First Republic.
So what are the authorities likely to do now?
Well, now it's really up to what happens next in terms of investor sentiment, how investors feel, and also looking forward, it's really about interest rates. So we saw that the ECB this week said they're going to raise interest rates by 0.5 percentage point as planned. Next week, the U.S. Federal Reserve, America's central bank, will be meeting, and I think a lot of people are paying close attention to see what exactly they will do, whether they will stay the course or if they will make a change in terms of interest rates.
Samira Hussain. A few weeks ago, the FBI concluded that the COVID pandemic was most likely caused by a leak in a biolab in the Chinese city of Wuhan. More recently, a former director of the Centers for Disease Control, Dr. Robert Redfield, told a US Congressional Committee hearing that he'd come to the same conclusion. That claim has never been substantiated, but there's concern that the number of labs handling deadly germs has multiplied, and they may not all be secure. Dr. Philippa Lentsos is based at King's College here in London and has written a report on the issue. And she's been speaking to Owen Bennett-Jones.
Biolabs in and of themselves are not worrying. They're there to make sure we work safely with dangerous bacteria and viruses. The worry is there's lots more of these now being built. The key concern is really that there are some risks that come with building these labs. There are risks about safety, risks to security, risk about potential dual use. How many of these labs do we really need?
Can you just explain to us why more are being built? I mean, who's building them and why?
Most of the labs are for public health purposes. There are some labs that are for defense purposes. There's some labs that are academic research labs. We're now seeing a boom in these labs following the pandemic.
And most of them in what, the West or in Asia? Where are they?
Most of the labs that are now being built are not being built in the places where they have traditionally been built. They're being built in Asia. They're being built in places that don't have the biosecurity, biosafety frameworks the legal frameworks in place to make sure that work with these pathogens is being done safely, securely and responsibly.
And you talked about dual use and defence. So some of them are being used to create, biological weapons, basically.
No, they're not being used to develop biological weapons. In order to find out what you need to defend yourself, you, to some extent, need to create those weapons. But I think that is much less of a concern than what we're seeing in sort of general high-risk biological research, where you are manipulating dangerous pathogens to make them even more dangerous.
Why do you do that, then?
You're making dangerous pathogens more dangerous in order to see what might be coming on the horizon, what pandemic might be hitting us next. Not everyone finds that argument convincing, myself included. And I think there are other means in which we can better prepare for future pandemics and outbreaks.
I get it. So this is basically what the Wuhan lab was doing in China. And as I said at the beginning in the introduction, it's not clear what happened there and whether there was a leak there or not. This is the sort of area you're talking about.
Yes. And of course, it's not just the Wuhan Institute of Virology that was doing these kinds of experiments. There are experiments like this in our own country, in facilities across the world. But what we're really trying to show is to step away from this picture that all of these facilities look like the Wuhan facility and are doing dangerous research like the Wuhan facility. Lots of these facilities are just there for doing medical analysis, diagnostics labs, essentially. It's really to get a sense of, well, how many of these labs are there? What are they working on? Who are they funded by? To map this space and get a sense of what the field looks like.
I guess the difficulty is that if you're working in one of these labs, it must be so easy to catch an illness from materials you're working with. And then as soon as you've walked out of the lab, you're a problem.
Which is why you build containment facilities, why you build these labs. It's to make sure you introduce practices, protocols to operate safely in these labs. So that's all aspects of biosafety, which is relatively well developed. And that's one of the things that we're seeing with the new labs being built, primarily in Asia. They don't have that regulatory framework in place. And so that is one of the real concerns. And we're hoping that by drawing attention to this, it will encourage those countries to make sure they have their legislation in place once those labs are finally operating.
Dr. Philippa Lentsos speaking to Owen Bennett-Jones. India's recent victories at the Academy Awards, winning Oscars for Best Original Song and Documentary Short, have given a big boost to the country's film industry. Oscar night demonstrated to a global audience how India is forging a new, vibrant form of escapist cinema, and that its documentary sector is also rapidly developing. From Los Angeles, Tom Brooke reports.
As I said, they appear shocked and surprised that they did it. I mean, the strike that you were looking at took place just about 30 miles from Bakhmut, which of course is the center of the frontline fighting right now. And according to a Ukrainian soldier there on the front lines, Russia appears to be on the defense right now. Last week, the enemy was furiously attacking. I'm quoting the Ukrainian soldier. And the attacks were of a maximum nature. He goes on to say it exhausted the enemy. And indeed, as of yesterday and today, the intensity of artillery fire has decreased. This means that we have partially exhausted the enemy, bled it out. They're talking about the dramatic change they've seen on the Russian sides. But those words, bled it out, are literal. Just listen to this. This is new audio into Outfront. And what you're going to be listening to here is two Russian soldiers. They're having a conversation. This is a conversation that was obtained by the Ukrainian Defense Intelligence. Listen for yourself.
Get a load of this. They are taking the wounded to the border. They are waiting there at the border to be let back into Russia, but they're simply dying from blood loss because they're waiting so long.
What do you mean? There shouldn't be anything blocking their way back to Russia.
It's just some cockamamie bullshit.
Those are two Russians literally saying that men are dying on the border, bleeding out, dying from bleeding out because they can't get help. It's unbelievable to imagine they're not even able to help their own wounded on the border. And there are so many who need help. Just look at this new video. This is Russian soldiers trying to cross a river in Bakhmut. They're spotted, and you can see within seconds surrounded by deadly strike after strike. And all of this comes as the International Criminal Court today issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, accusing him of war crimes for allegedly deporting children from Ukraine to Russia. Now, those children used as political pawns. They've been paraded on stages at rallies held by Putin to celebrate Russia's army. The Kremlin dismissing the warrants, calling them meaningless. But still, these Putin is only the third serving head of state ever to get an arrest warrant. The other two, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, he was killed 4 months after the ICC issued a warrant, and Sudan's Omar al-Bashir. He is supposed to be handed over to the ICC, reportedly remains hospitalized. Now, we're going to have much more on the charges against Putin in just a moment. But first, I want to show you the exclusive access that CNN has been given to the massive international security operation to keep vital infrastructure safe from Russia's military in Ukraine. A military, of course, that is both reckless and irresponsible in addition to targeting that infrastructure. A military that Russia continues to celebrate. The defense minister today decorating the pilots who took down that American drone over the Black Sea, even though it appeared to be accidental that they hit it. I want to start with Fred Pleiken and his exclusive reporting on how the international community is bracing for possible new attacks by Russia. He's out front live tonight in Bergen, Norway. And Fred, what are you learning?
Hi there, and we're learning that NATO and the U.S. alliance certainly are not taking any chances as far as that is concerned. They saw what happened to that U.S. drone over the Black Sea, and they're extremely concerned about critical infrastructure among the U.S.'s allies here in Europe, specifically energy infrastructure. So what we did today is we went onto the North Sea, onto one of the biggest gas platforms on the North Sea, and we saw that NATO is really beefing up its presence there. Here's what we learned.
As tensions mount after the collision between a Russian plane and a U.S. drone over the Black Sea, NATO's head tells me the alliance stands firmly behind the U.S.
What you've seen is
Last year, the Nord Stream pipeline between Germany and Russia was blown up in what the U.S. says was an act of sabotage. While some believe Ukrainians might be behind the explosion, Kyiv denies involvement, and the EU Commission head tells me Europe will continue to support Ukraine. And Russian President Vladimir Putin is set to meet Chinese leader Xi Jinping in Moscow next week, as the Russians are looking to further deepen ties, and the U.S. believes want Beijing to give them weapons. But as long as the war continues, NATO says its ships will stay on alert, shielding the alliance members' critical infrastructure from possible attacks.
And Aaron, there were several warships from the NATO alliance around that gas platform alone, just to show how important that is. In the meantime, of course, we know that the fighting in Ukraine is really ferocious and continues to be ferocious. I got an update from the Ukrainian military, and they say especially on the northeastern front in Crimea, there's a lot of fighting going on. But of course, also, as you mentioned, in Bakhmut as well, where the Russians are continuing those efforts to try and encircle that city. Well, at the same time, as you said, some Ukrainian soldiers believe that they might have exhausted that Russian force, and they could see an opening to try and launch a counterattack there as well, Aaron.
All right. Thank you very much. And let's go now to Christo Grozev, the lead Russia investigator for Bellingcat. He has been put on Russia's wanted list for his work uncovering the men who poisoned Putin opposition leader Alexei Navalny. And you can see all of that, of course, in the now Oscar-winning documentary Navalny. Also out front, Phillips O'Brien, professor of strategic studies at the University of St. Andrews, who, of course, has been so tirelessly chronicling and following this war. So thanks so much to both of you. Let me start with you, Phil. Fred mentioned Putin's upcoming meeting with the Chinese President Xi. And the U.S. believes that that meeting is in part because Putin wants China to give him more weapons. And I know you've been looking at a lot of this. How bad is Putin's weapons shortage right now?
Well, I mean, we have to understand Russia is not a great power economically. It's really a relatively small economy. It's not a productive economy. It's a resource extract. It can't make nearly the amount of war material that it is using up at a vast rate. I mean, before the war, say it was making 200 tanks a year was one of the estimates. And yet they've lost, 16 to 1700 tanks that we've seen destroyed. And they're probably could be hundreds and hundreds more that have also been destroyed. So if Russia's going to be left fighting to its own devices, it will run out of weapons. It'll run out of a lot of weapons much sooner than anyone anticipated a year ago. So if Russia is going to fight a long war, and that seems to be what Putin is saying now, he's going to need to get a regular and steady supply of Chinese weapons to do that.
Well, it's pretty incredible when you lay that out, right? I mean, you're talking about knowing that they've lost an 8-year supply of tanks, as you're saying, and that's obviously a very low estimate. So, Christo, when the context of this, the International Criminal Court, making Putin a formal international pariah, right, with this warrant, right? So it's not as if anyone in the world is going to change how they see this based on this, but it makes it formal. And you've spent a lot of time investigating Russian war crimes in Ukraine. So what does this mean for Putin, right? He's obviously not going to be able to travel anywhere, that he could be arrested. How does this impact him in Russia?
Well, it does, and whoever says that it's going to be ignored or maybe even hidden from the general public is wrong or has been wrong. We see that leading Russian political figures had to comment on this today and make it even amplified in public within Russia, because a lot of bloggers, a lot of people on the Russian Telegram channel, which is the main source of information for most Russians about the war today, have started talking about the fact that he was indicted. And the reason why this matters is, first of all, it eliminates a fantasy, a sort of a conspiracy theory that the Kremlin has been trying to promulgate among its people, that there's this global conspiracy that protects Putin, that protects the big leaders, that it's all a game that is happening, and that the West will never go after the big wigs and like Putin. And what happened today is literally the top wig was indicted and an arrest warrant was issued. And think about the message that this will have for anybody below him, because while Putin will not be able to travel or will not travel to be arrested, I mean, a lot of people below him who know that they're committing crimes or they may be committing crimes may think twice, because they're younger. They may hope to one day have to travel to their favorite destinations. I mean, even the second person who was invited, Maria Belova, she's much younger. She has a hope for a new life after the war. And this acts as a deterrent to Putin's commanders, to people working in the system.
So to try to understand the scope of what's happening on the ground here, Phil, when you look at the situation on the ground in Bakhmut, Ukraine is saying Russia's slowing down their attacks. Obviously, I was just quoting a Ukrainian soldier saying that. I'm sorry. And I want to share a little bit more about what he had to say. He said, quote, "The enemy was in a hurry, threatening, telling that Bakhmut was surrounded and sent its soldiers to be killed, in particular on our part of the front. Accordingly, the fighting was as intense as possible. It exhausted the enemy." Phil, we're hearing this from all levels of the Ukrainian military right now, that the Russians are exhausted. Is that the reality? Is that sort of the way Russians want them to see it? And they've got some kind of, group coming in? And how many Russians really are dying right now in these battles?
Well, I mean, there's a few things going on here. There seems to be, at least temporarily, we don't know if it's a temporary or a longer term relenting in Russian attacks, Aaron, that you compared to last week when they were throwing everything in to try and take Bakhmut and attacking on both sides to the north and south, trying to get over the river. And the last few days, these offensives have stopped and the map hasn't changed. Now, what we don't know is if this is the kind of thing that is a temporary thing. But Russia's been trying to take Bakhmut for 8 months. Yeah. 8 months they've been throwing troops at this town, and they still haven't been able to take it. So I think we can say, what the Ukrainians have done is decided, and what we don't know is what Ukrainian losses have been. But the Ukrainians have made the Russians pay a massive price to take Bakhmut. And as long as the Ukrainians' losses themselves are not as nearly as high, then that was probably the right strategic choice. It's a terrible battle. It's a horrible battle, but it's one where the Russians, in some estimates, are losing 5-1. That was a NATO estimate, 5-1. Another NATO estimate was recently the Russians in the Bakhmut area could be losing 1,200 to 1,500 casualties a day. Now, that's not just killed, that's killed and wounded. But that the Russians are losing huge numbers of troops to try and take this town and huge numbers of equipment.
Those numbers are staggering, though, as you point out, 1,200 to 1,500 a day. Obviously, it would include casualties, but those numbers are remarkable. And Christo, I mentioned at the beginning when I introduced you, of course, in addition to now being, an Oscar winner for the work you did on Navalny, you're on Russia's wanted list, in part because of that work. And you have been investigating your own would-be killers. And you've described it as a race against time, that you're either going to find them or they're going to kill you. And when we spoke a couple weeks ago, you likened it to a doctor operating on their own appendix. Have you made any progress? Are you able to tell us?
International when it comes to military things. He is from the Macdonald Laurier Institute, and we appreciate his time. Thank you very much for joining us, Richard.
Well, I've set the bar really high.
All right, I have. Are you surprised that Slovakia has decided to give 13 MiG-20, they're MiG-29s, I do believe, to Ukraine? These are warplanes that I guess originated in the Soviet Union. Does that shock you at all?
Not really. I think what has probably happened, and I'm fairly certain this happened, is that most of their spare parts for these aircraft have already been given. And it's really just airframes that are kind of sitting around. I know most of the Slovakian jets are actually not in great shape anyways. So passing these along isn't that surprising at this stage of the war.
And what do you think that this will allow Ukraine to do that they might not have had the wherewithal to do in the past?
Well, it's interesting because this started off, I think, 2 days ago when Poland announced that it was giving its MiG-29 fleet. That aircraft is being withdrawn from service slowly as they've selected the F-35 and a bunch of other aircraft to replace it. And what's interesting about the Polish and Slovakian MiG-29s is that a lot of them have been upgraded using Western equipment, so that they're actually much more capable than the Ukrainian ones. They're able to use, in some cases, Western munitions, such as GPS-guided bombs. So that's interesting to me because that allows the Ukrainians to be supplied with Western arms, long-range missiles, stuff like that, and the GPS bombs, as I said, and be able to actually attack targets that may not have been available to be attacked with their existing MiG-29 fleets, which are really, for the most part, with some exceptions, only able to use Soviet-era weapons that aren't really that accurate. They don't have great range and whatnot. So that's really I think the crux of what is interesting about those aircraft, that they're actually a little bit more capable than their existing MiG-29s.
So how many fighter jets right now at this time does Ukraine have? It can't be that many since they've been begging for this since the beginning of the war.
We don't know. This is one of the interesting parts about Ukraine is that they've actually been very good at hiding their losses. And this is not just an Air Force thing. This extends actually quite a bit to their land forces. And so as we're watching how the combat's going on right now, we know that the Russians are, suffered 140, 150,000 casualties in their field. It's one of the bloodiest conflicts that the Russian Federation is engaged in, if you consider all the way back to the Second World War, right? But we just don't know how badly the Ukrainians have suffered. We have some guesses, but it's not clear. And so it's really actually kind of tough to assess what's going on in the war without knowing that side.
Do you see any other countries? I'm guessing Western countries like Britain, Canada, and the United States aren't going to do that.
Provide jets?
Yeah.
No. One of the big reasons why is that Western or NATO sort of standard jets are actually pretty significantly different to operate. Two of the things that are actually pretty critical, all the dials are in Cyrillic with MiG-29s. Obviously, they're English or for Western aircraft. And so they just operate differently. The training will take years for them to transition over. And if you have a finite number of sort of maintainers and pilots, you kind of don't want to run two different fleets right now because you just don't have the people to run both.
I think you're wrong on that. You clearly haven't seen Top Gun. Tom Cruise was able to go and fly the old Soviet planes with no problem. So I think you want to check your research.
Well, actually, I think he was flying the F-14 that was used by the Iranians.
It wasn't the
Iranians, but it wasn't. Yes, but it's all good.
On a serious note, did you make anything of them not necessarily having a bad guy, and in both Top Gun movies just saying the enemy?
I don't know. It's always been a touchy subject, right? You don't want to kind of piss people off, I guess, but you do. I'm not too sure. I mean, maybe it's easier to.
I just thought you might have a take. I know I kind of put you on the spot on that.
Now, I mean, certainly it's Iran. Like, I mean, if you look at everything about it, it's basically Iran. Like, it's kind of a weird kind of dodge, if that makes sense. So no.
All right, okay. And then finally, we're seeing the leaders of Russia and the leaders of China meeting. Is this bad news for Ukraine? I've heard enough people say that China, as much as the West might not be happy with them right now, they've got way too much invested in things in the West to actually really peeve off America and their allies.
Yeah, and I think everybody's watching that summit. Now, one of the things that's probably pretty important to understand is that for all the world leaders internationally, for Xi, Putin's he's probably been the closest, and they've met of all them. I can't remember off the top of my head, but he's met Putin far more than anybody else, and it seems like they have a good, close, personal working relationship. So the fact they haven't actually been fully in Russia's camp since the start of the war is interesting. So this may not signal a huge change, but we've certainly seen that and we've seen warnings, I should say, from the United States to China that they may be considering giving them more support. They've been giving them support pretty minimally, but they may sort of increase what they're able to give or what they're providing. So that, it's kind of a TBD kind of situation. We don't know, but it could signal something. It might not. It's just too early to tell.
It's too early to tell, but you don't think that is something that they're smart enough to know, hey, we can't get too deep into this because, that might trigger, I don't know. Would you say that if they got really into it, that it would trigger a world war?
No, I think the real risk is that you would see increasing sanctions put on China. And I think they understand that if they were to go and increase their support to Russia, that some of their firms may be hit by sanctions or other sort of countermeasures towards them. And I mean, they've been hit by some of the biggest ones recently on AI and sort of computer chip production. But going forward, I think they kind of want to avoid that. That's always sort of kept at top of mind. I know Secretary Blinken has kind of warned them, and there's been some more diplomatic efforts to sort of help convince them and cajole them not to provide support. So the U.S. is, cognizant of it and trying to avoid it. Again, it is too early to determine where this is going to go.
When the mall cop says to me, stop, or I'll say stop again, is that basically the same as the International Criminal Court issuing an arrest warrant for Putin?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously Putin's probably never going to face a trial. It'd be extremely unlikely. They're not a party to the Rome Convention, which, science. So, I mean, this is, that's kind of the operative sort of issue. I think it just maybe just illustrates a little bit that there is a consensus against this. But I think that if you think about Putin and what he's thought of since he's come into power, it's just a general disdain towards all things Western and sort of these multilateral bodies like NATO, like the ICC. So another one that's kind of going up against him. I mean, we've already isolated them that much.
Yeah.
So,
Richard, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Military expert, senior fellow with the Macdonald Laurier Institute. Always good to hear from Richard Shmuka.